Article in the Star yesterday, how antagonism and a lot of mistrust is driving a wedge between landlords and tenants. I've kind of seen both sides of this. I've been a tenant a few times. My dad was a landlord. My brothers still are landlords. And there was always this idea of if you've got a great tenant who pays the rent on time, you're not chasing them, they're respectful, they communicate with you, they're keeping the place in order, you always want to keep somebody like that. Like, why would you want to risk that and try to find somebody else who maybe is not, as responsible or wanting to talk or being open about what the issues are or what problems they're having? You always want to help somebody who helps you. You want to help back. Caryma Sa'd is a lawyer who specializes in landlord-tenant cases. Thank you so much for joining us this morning in person. What's happening to the relationship between landlords and tenants? We had a bit of a blow a couple of weeks ago. Red flag deals. They've got a forum section, and I guess this came up. Landlords discussing how they could, with real reason, get rid of tenants.
Yeah, so I mean, there was a thread of somewhat unscrupulous landlords sharing ideas back and forth. How do we most effectively evict someone? And the idea being that the sooner you can get someone out, the sooner you can put someone new in. And in theory, that's at a higher rent. So I think that that's ultimately what's driving this latest iteration of tension. It's a widening gap between landlords, tenants, and a rental market where the market rate continues to increase. It's far outpacing what tenants can afford to do.
And tenants, having been one, Mike, you're one as well. It's not only hard now to find something, but you got to find somebody who's honest. Like, I would not want to rent from someone who's, trying to rip me off at every turn. But you want to rent from somebody who's going to be respectful of your space and, helping you out wherever they can. You want to be the same way back. So I think at one point there was a relationship, but now it's just kind of disintegrated.
I mean, yes, there has to be some give and take. And I think what you described at the outset is the ideal symbiotic relationship where, you have someone who's paying the rent, they're on time, they're respectful. And the flip side of that is this is their home. And so they're entitled to certain protections. And that's how the law is designed to operate. But in practice, landlords sometimes can and do find backdoors or alternate routes to get someone out, displace a person, not because they've done anything wrong, but simply because the landlord stands to profit more from that unit without necessarily having invested more into that unit, right? Because it's a little bit different when we talk about a huge renovation, and so now there's marble countertops and you're deriving some additional benefit. Here we're talking tenants or properties that are the same, but for rising market rent around them.
Well, I mean, you are a lawyer. You represent tenants' interests. You also represent landlord. You can be very torn on this because my parents they weren't rich. They had a property outside of London, and they were moving back to Toronto. They wanted to rent it. They found a family, a man and a woman and 2 kids. He was employed. They got 2 months' rent, and the check stopped. And it was a hell because they weren't rich. They weren't going to be making a lot of money off this. They just wanted to come back to Toronto. Yet I also know landlords who are taking advantage. Caryma, when I was in the 1980s as a younger person, I would open the Toronto Star Saturday Classifieds. I had my pick of apartments.
Yeah, no more.
Now the landlords know they hold the power.
And I mean, I think that you've hit on an important point, which is that there are unscrupulous people on both sides and there's good people on both sides. I think what's different now, maybe compared to the 80s, is the supply of rental units. And part of that is factors outside of an individual landlord's control. So we have fewer buildings that are specifically for rentals. We also have this phenomenon of short-term rentals, Airbnb. And I know that new rules are being passed to try and curb that. But where there's a short supply of rentals, that gives a disproportionate amount of power to landlords.
We had a Vice author, an author from the Vice website, who'd done a story a couple of months ago on the rental situation in Toronto. If you're applying as well, you're up against people who are prepaying 9-10 months. Is that even legal?
So it's not legal for a landlord to request or demand that. But if a tenant is making that gesture voluntarily and, query how we actually define that in a situation where there's such competition that it's the de facto, you must do this in order to apply. It's not legal according to law, but if someone voluntarily offers it, it may be something that can be entertained.
Is that quite common, landlords coming to their tenants and saying, look, I've got a family member moving in, you've got to leave, 60 days?
So with that scenario, 60 days is the minimum notice requirement. I think it's important for landlords to know that it doesn't mean at the end of the 60 days that person is out packing, because the individual may want to challenge that notice. They may think that it's untrue, or they may have special circumstances that would justify an extension of time and thus have a hearing before the Landlord-Tenant Board. And that can take some time. So
that's while they're still living there. But do they have does a tenant have any recourse after they've moved out?
So if they do move out and it comes to pass that in fact there is no family member moving in, that was a ruse, a tenant can make an application for an eviction in bad faith. They would have to prove that the notice was given in bad faith, and show what additional expenses that they have incurred. And a landlord could be on the hook for that.
Now, has anyone been successful that you know of pursuing that avenue? There
have been cases, reported in the news as well, what we read in the reported decisions. It's an uphill battle for tenants, but it is something that can be won, especially if they do a good job collecting evidence.
We got about another minute and a half here. I just wanted to ask the Landlord-Tenant Board. I read this article on the weekend. They seem overwhelmed. They seem swamped.
There's a lot of cases, a lot of stuff to wade through, and everything takes time, especially where the stakes are high and people really want to have their situation heard. And for a period of time, we were dealing with a shortage of adjudicators. I think that created some backlog. I don't know where we're at as far as relieving that bottleneck, but it's not a fast process.
Does the termination suspend when you filed with the Landlord-Tenant Board until you can be heard?
It's more that no eviction order is made or issued until a decision maker has a chance to look at the file. Someone can decide to leave without having a hearing, but if they do want a hearing, then someone needs to decide, yes, you're out.
And I just want to ask a quick question about that Red Flag Deals Forum. Is there any kind of punishment for these landlords who were discussing like ways to get rid of tenants?
I mean, I think that a lot of the handles were anonymous, not necessarily tied to an individual. If someone could prove that so-and-so is the person making these comments, that wouldn't bode well in a future landlord-tenant application. But for the time being, I don't know that there's any recourse.
All right. Well, Caryma Sa'd, thank you so much for your insight on this. She's a lawyer who specializes in landlord-tenant